storytelling are like trees that have been grafted together as seedlings. They're joined so closely together that it's impossible to pick apart their roots. Time is what makes stories possible. All stories require sequencing. All narratives proceed by creating connections between moments, events, and characters. The greater the sweep of the narrative, the more heavily it must lean on the past, on history, real or imagined. Many storytellers are in fact nothing other than historians working with invented sources. The terrain of history is not an evenly populated continent. As in any landscape, the tracts that are brightly lit are relatively few. It's not always because of a lack of habitation that these regions remain shrouded. Often it's because they're yet to find the story that might set their skies alight. This is one very important thing that fiction can do in relation to the past. It can serve as the light that allows us to step into dimly lit places. If fiction is able to do this, it's largely because it works through characters. These protagonists become, as it were, the explorers who reveal the landscape to us. But there is a paradox here, for it could be said, after all, that a history that reveals itself through invented protagonists is itself ahistorical and anachronistic, since these characters must be so fashioned as to be recognizable to contemporary readers. To my mind, this assigns too literal a meaning to the kind of identity that readers seek with fictional characters. What readers actually identify with, I think, is not the characters themselves, but rather their predicaments. At the risk of making too sweeping a claim, I would say that the principal reason why storytellers turn to the past is because history is replete with compelling human predicaments. This is where my own interest in history begins. I'm drawn to the past because it provides instances of predicaments that are unique and unrepeatable. Instances that have more to say about the human condition than anything I could make up out of whole cloth. This provides a principle of economy, an equivalent of Occam's razor. Everything that goes into the book has to pertain to our understanding of the character's predicaments. This then becomes the fundamental principle that guides both my research and my relating of it. This means that writing and research cannot be separated from each other. Until I start developing a character, I don't know where to look. It's only after I start writing that I discover what I need to know. Approaching history through characters makes the novelist's relationship to the past substantially different from the historian's. In most respects, the novelist's understanding of the subject is far less complete, far less rigorous than that of the historian. This goes without saying. But it also bears saying that there are some respects in which seeing the past through the prism of a character's experience allows for a kind of wholeness that is unavailable to the historian. This is because the protocols of historical research impose certain constraints. In the same way that a novel is shaped by its protagonists, a historical monograph is shaped by its subjects and the questions it asks. The trade historian sees a busy port. The historian of science sees a city with innumerable nurseries. The art historian sees a gathering of studios. This limitation is also a strength in that it provides a focus of inquiry and delimits the range of materials that allows the professional historian the right to assert claims to truth, or at least verifiability. A work of fiction cannot make truth claims, no matter how detailed or exhaustive the research. Yet, in rendering a setting through the eyes of individuals, a novel can take on the task of recreating the wholeness of a character's experience. Of course, this project would not be possible if historians had not laid the foundations. Yet I think I can honestly say that after reading many historical monographs and studies of Canton, I had very little understanding of what interested me most, which is, what was it like to actually be there? To inhabit a place is to be able to see it, to experience it through one's senses. Here again, the capaciousness of the novel as a form is a marvelous resource. In a study of trade, there is no place for banquets and gardens. The novelist faces no such restrictions. If trade, banquets, and gardens are aspects of his character's experience, then they all belong legitimately within the book. But of course, any scene, whether in the past or the present, consists of an infinite variety of details. What is to be included and what is to be left out. In deciding this, I follow a simple rule. I include everything that is of interest to me and leave out everything that is not. The questions that are relevant to me when I'm trying to inhabit a setting are rarely answered by historical accounts. There is, however, one branch of history that does look at the past in much the same way. This is military history, particularly where it provides accounts of battles. The overlap here is quite striking. The questions asked and the details provided are very similar. The weather, the terrain, the clothing, the equipment, the states of mind and body. This is all of as much interest to the military historian as to the novelist. Nor is this the only commonality. It extends also to the treatment of time. As with novelists, they write about moments that stand out in time, that is, battles. In other words, both the novelist and the military historian deal with the jagged edges of the temporal continuum. Most historians, on the other hand, deal with what we might call smooth time, in which the peaks and valleys of the timeline are either flattened or ignored. There is another very important aspect of the past that is sometimes more accessible to the novelist than to the historian. This is, simply put, historical passion, the feelings, emotions, and intimate interpersonal relationships and connections that often drive events. I think most historians would acknowledge this. It's perhaps the reason why they read historical fiction, if they do, and they do. How important should this be to our understanding of the past? Well, I'm sure we all differ in the weight we assign to it. I remember an occasion many years ago when I gave a draft manuscript of my book in an antique land to one of my contemporaries, a scholar who has since proved to be possibly the most brilliant Indian historian of my generation. After reading my manuscript, he advised me to throw it into the dustbin and remarked in a voice seething with contempt that I seem to be more interested in feelings than in trade. Of course, it's true that in the longue durée, emotions have very little effect on history. But it's also true that they sometimes play a critical role in events. So much so that certain very important events become incomprehensible if emotions and passions are excluded. Take the first Opium War, an event that was to have momentous consequences for the whole world. The war was in one respect a product of a deep history, brought on by seismic shifts in the relations between land masses and continents. Yet, as with many seismic events, the tremors that set the eruption in motion originated in a place that was very small, the foreign enclave in Canton. In reading the standard historical accounts of the war, it became clear to me that the events were actually set in motion by a very small number of players in the space of a few months. Yet from the secondary accounts, it was impossible to make sense of what transpired. The picture seemed contradictory and completely incoherent. It was when I began to reconstruct what the actors were doing and saying from day to day and hour to hour that a picture began to emerge of a group of people who were lying, bullying, wooing, hectoring, and jockeying for advantage in a manner that would be familiar to anyone who's ever served on a committee. Yeah. Perhaps the most formidable barrier to inhabiting the worlds that I write about is that of language. The action of the Ibis trilogy, for instance, unfolds in a theatre that teems with languages and dialects. How is the novelist to inhabit or recreate this multilingual setting? A novel can perhaps accommodate 2 or more languages if they happen to be written in the same or similar scripts as in Western Europe. But in the Indian Ocean, even the scripts are completely different. Clearly, there can be no literal solution to this conundrum. I'd like to return now to something I said at the outset, that the absence of stories can create a void that resists the intrusion of both historian and novelist. No one who writes about the subjects I deal with can be unmindful of this. Take 19th century India. The stories of this past are told overwhelmingly from a British and European point of view. No matter whether it be the opium trade, the wars with China, the uprising of 1857, the emigration of millions of coolies, or the experience of the millions of Indian soldiers who fought Britain's wars, the Indian voice is often unrecoverable. Some might say that this sort of lack of a sort of evidentiary record in relation to India is because India is an unhistorical or ahistorical civilization in which little value is accorded to the historical record. Disputing this, Romila Thapa recited the extensive record of Buddhist monks and Hindu and Muslim chroniclers. I think she's fundamentally right. I don't believe that it's an aversion to record keeping that is responsible for the paucity of Indian sources in the 19th and early 20th centuries. I think it's essentially because the Indians of that time had yet to find a story, a narrative, to give meaning to their experiences. To relate a meaningless experience is almost impossible. It defies telling, and the earlier stories and narratives simply did not apply to what was happening around them. For me, this has been a critical challenge. When I started writing The Glass Palace, I intended it to be a historical memoir about my family. It quickly became evident to me that if I depended on sources, my story would hardly be worth telling. What does one do in those circumstances? Prolong the silence or invent a story? To me, the answer was obvious. So I'll stop there.